Hello, and welcome to the Learn to Code podcast with 1 month. This week, we have Mike Heavers on the show. Mike has been designing, strategizing, and coding for the web for over 23 years. He works with HTML, React, JavaScript, Python, as well as other tools like After Effects, Ableton, and most recently, machine learning. He's also worked with companies like Nike, Facebook, Lululemon, and universities like Cornell and Carnegie Mellon. Today, we'll be discussing what goes into being a successful freelance developer. We have Mike on the show. Welcome, Mike. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, I am super excited to talk with you, especially because, well, we've worked together on a handful of projects.
Yeah,
Yeah, here in New York City.
we go
Uh,
way back.
Actually, that's where we met, working at an agency, which we can get to, working on, I think it was the Black Eyed Peas website blog thing.
Yeah, right.
Right. And during that time, I've really seen you really grow as a consultant or freelance developer, really like being able to do your own thing and go from job to job, in like a really free and what I've seen fulfilling career. So I want to dive into that. But before we get there, I just want to start at the beginning, where are you coming from? How did you learn to code? All of that so that we can, dive into your story. So let's start at the beginning. Well, where were you raised? Where were you born? Where are you from? What's your story? Who are you? Who are you? Tell us. Who are you?
Yeah, I'm from a small town in Colorado called Montrose. It's kind of on the western slope, so people in Colorado divide the state into western and eastern slope depending on what side of the Rocky Mountains you're on. So I'm from a small town there, and I had a really good computer lab teacher. This was back in, gosh, 96, I'd say, when the internet was still somewhat new to folks and especially to people in small towns. And all this technology was new. And I had this teacher who just was really great about applying for grants for software and hardware. Um, and so we had a really cool computer lab that he just kind of gave us free reign to play around with. And one of the things in the lab was a copy of Dreamweaver, which I guess is still maybe limping along, but
So
people.
Dreamweaver, can you explain what that is in case nobody's
Sure,
heard of
yeah,
it?
it's sort of a more visual way, I guess, to program websites where you can actually see the thing being built in a preview window. It's owned by Adobe. I think at the time it was owned by Macromedia.
Mm-hmm.
And we
Yeah.
also had a copy of Flash, which at that time was called Future Splash. And I got to play around with that too.
So in this computer lab in your high school, were there classes that were teaching you how to code, or did you kind of have to pick it up on your own?
We kind of had to pick it up on our own because nobody really knew. We had books and things like that we were learning from, but the teacher of the class, he just in, kind of oversaw everything and really encouraged us to try everything and come away with a complete project. But there was really no curriculum.
What was what was the first thing that you made or did that you felt like, oh, I can make code work. I can make things happen.
We had to make a website for ourselves, but I think that the first thing, because I could kind of picked up on it pretty quickly, uh, I got enlisted to help make our high school's website as it sort of took shape. And being able to do that for something other than myself was really a big boost of encouragement into, yeah, hey, I can make this work. This is a really useful skill.
So you made the high school's website with like HTML and CSS, but using Dreamweaver is what you were
Yeah.
using. Yeah. Okay.
And there was no CSS back then. It was all HTML.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
I think CSS was invented in, I want to say, I think it was invented in the 90s, but I don't think it really took off until maybe 99, 2000 ish.
Yeah, it may have been around at sort of the later stages of this thing, but yeah, initially I definitely wasn't using it. I was just using HTML.
Yeah, interesting. And then how did you go from, okay, you're building this really basic HTML website for your high school to making a career building apps and building websites. Was that linear? Did you know, hey, this is what I want to do, like right from there?
Not at all. I did a couple websites in college, but for the most part, really just put it away and didn't touch it. Was in school in the journalism program, and it got unaccredited for about 6 months, and I knew I could only be in school for 4 years, so I looked for a different field and went into business school, and I got a degree in finance, and just sort of blindly pushed through that. And when I graduated, I realized, oh, I don't actually want to work in finance. And so I had to figure out another way to make money. And I and at that time the web was really becoming popular, and everybody wanted a website. I was out in LA at this point, and sort of surrounded by a lot of aspiring actors and movie makers and all of the business. And it was a really good way. A lot of people would approach me to kind of put their public face up online, and so that's how I got started making websites.
Wow. When was the first time that someone paid you to make a website? What was that like?
Oh, that's a good question. I got paid for a few in college, and I did some for nonprofits. I think the first one I remember was for sort of like a low budget movie. It was sort of like, I want to say like a B movie, but I don't know if that implies that it's seedy or something, because it wasn't. It was just like a lesser known, smaller production company that paid me to do their website, and it paid pretty well for the amount of time that it took me to do everything. It paid pretty well, and I got to be on both the designing and coding side of things, which was really interesting to me. I always thought I wanted to be a designer, and that coding was just a way to kind of get paid to design. And then sort of as I learned more about coding, I transitioned more fully into being just the coder and not the designer.
Wow. So I always found when I was getting started that it was tricky because I didn't necessarily have enough confidence to charge money for projects.
Mm-hmm.
At first I was like, oh, I'll just do it for free, or oh, I felt like I couldn't accept certain jobs because I just like I didn't have that confidence. What about you? Like, how did you have the confidence to start charging? Was it their idea? Like, how did that come about for you, or did you just feel like, no, this is something I can do?
I guess there was enough demand that I knew, and I knew that it took enough time that I had to charge something, but I was definitely undercharging for my services even then. I think I would sometimes work for $15 or $20 an hour,
Okay.
making websites, and it was actually, at some point it was really starting to kill me, because I was getting a lot of referrals to do websites. So I was taking a lot on because I knew it was money, and I didn't have a lot of money at that time. But I was charging such a low rate that I had to put in a lot of work and manage a lot of different clients to make that really pay off. And
Totally.
and you know, I think it has taken me a long, I still shoot myself in the foot in this way sometimes, but it's taken me a long time to really become comfortable charging what I think I'm worth and what I need to make in order to kind of have the work-life balance that I want.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely for a web developer, such an in need job. That's definitely a low rate for that. So, it is an interesting question though. How do you choose your rate, and how do you,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like all that stuff. Like, how do you build the confidence to charge more? And so this might be a good segue to really the focus of the conversation that I want to get into is just like, how do you become a successful freelancer? Maybe you could start by just telling us in your own words some of the projects that you've worked on, and then maybe one or two that you're really proud about, and just to give us a sense of the types of different projects, because I know you've worked on so many different projects. Like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I've really done a lot, and I feel like there's a couple of approaches to being a freelance developer. There's the approach where you really dive in deep to one specific platform or technology, and then there's the generalist route, which is the one that I've taken. Um, I worked for agencies pretty exclusively until maybe a few years ago, and as such, I think you get to touch a lot of different technology and take on a lot of different projects. They're
Yeah.
they're also kind of shorter length engagements.
Could you just define what an agency is? Because I remember when I first heard that word, I was a little bit, I had an idea, but maybe you could clear it up for us a little bit. What is an agent? What is a web development agency or a digital agency?
Sure. Yeah, and I kind of use that term loosely, and I think some people actually recoil at the name of an agency, or not recoil, but they like to distinguish between an agency and a studio, or people have different terms for it. But
What is the
essentially,
difference? Yeah, what's the difference there too? Maybe break that apart for us.
I think what I've noticed, and I don't know, I have a hard time delineating things as well, but I think that uh, companies that position themselves very creatively as sort of artists like to be considered studios. They're creative studios. Um, and companies that cater a little more towards the client and whatever they need might consider themselves agencies, ad agencies, or digital agencies, to where they're just like uh, they are there to make whatever you need to happen online happen. Versus a studio is like, we're the artists, come to us. We've got good ideas and capabilities, and we can kind of make this thing happen in our own way. So
So maybe it's like the difference between hiring a painter and like one type of painter paints your walls and the other type like makes Picasso paintings.
that's a really good analogy. I like that. Yeah,
Like one
yeah.
person is not going to argue. He's not going to be like, "Hey, your living room should be like a blue splat." He's just like, "Just paint the wall. Just do what I
Yeah.
tell you to do."
Totally. And I
Perfect.
think I think also agencies tend to be a little bit bigger and take on things that aren't just digital. Like, they'll take on PR and print advertising and things like that. So uh,
Yeah. How did you let's talk about one of your experiences working at an agency. I know you worked at Maverick Digital, which is where I met you.
yeah,
Was how did you and tell us about that? How did you end up there? Like what kind of stuff were you doing at an agent at that agency?
I'm smiling really big right now because I'm thinking about just some of the funny situations that we ended up in at Maverick Digital. I started, and I didn't know this, but I started at Maverick when it was uh, brand new to the world, and it was started by a really great guy, Todd Tilley, who used to work for Bacardi, and he started the agency up under the auspices of taking on the Bacardi business and doing some of their digital work. And when I interviewed with him, I was brand new to New York City, and I went into his building. He had a really nice space. I didn't realize at the time he was sharing it with other people, and there was like four or five, people in the room when I met him. And right away when I met him, he said, "Oh, come on up outside. Let's go for coffee." So I didn't really get to have a good look around, but I didn't realize it. I was essentially like his first or second employee. It was just me and Todd and like one other person. So we
Wow.
started really uh, from the ground floor. And I think by the time you and I were working together, it was maybe what, 15 people, 20 people?
Yeah, it seemed like a really big fancy agency when I mean at the top of that skyscraper building, whatever, the Martha Stewart building in Chelsea. It was like
Yeah, the Star at Lehigh building.
that's the one. What kind of tips would you give for somebody that wants to work at an agency if you want to, start putting together some clients in your portfolio, like these big Grey Goose or not Blackberry? No. um,
Um,
but how do you get to work with big clients like that? Like, what's the first step to that? How did you do it?
the first step, I think, is really, I think, showcasing what work you do have in its best light and not being shy about that. Being honest in what parts that you worked on, if maybe you didn't do the whole thing or whatever, or if it wasn't for a real client, but just showcasing your work and spending time documenting the work that you do in a way that's really clear to other people that you're confident and know what you're doing, and are capable of working at the caliber or level that they're looking for. So I know some people, if all they did was schoolwork, student work, you can still make a website, whether it's for a fake client or a real one. You can make a website and show it off as if it was as your only thing. And I think when you put that kind of stuff online, if you don't have a lot of work, it's making that one project that you feel really good about as big and thorough as possible. And if you have a ton of work, then it's maybe more of kind of showcasing that breadth or that versatility. But, just picking an angle that people can look at really quickly and say, okay, I can see how this person would fit into our organization. Let's bring them in and talk to them.
It sounds like an organization like Maverick or like these big New York City agencies are probably getting dozens or hundreds of applicants, I would imagine. And I'd imagine that 90% of them are horrible, just because I've seen a lot of these applications come in. How do you stand out? You're saying, you're saying showcase your work. Does that come from, you applying with a CV or a resume? Does it mean like having examples like a portfolio or a recommendation? Like, how did you assemble? I mean, it clearly worked for you. How did you assemble that portfolio or whatever it was?
Definitely. I had recommendations through various people I had created freelance websites for, but I also had a website that I think was somewhat unique, and I also approached the agencies with kind of like a personal email. Like I'd just dig up an address and and rather than go through the traditional channel of like apply online, or maybe in addition to just applying online through whatever service they wanted, I would just drop them a line and write a really personal story about how I was excited to do the type of work that they were doing, what I thought of their work, and how I saw that I might fit in. And I think a lot of people do that too, but it definitely cuts through the playing field quite a bit. And if you've had any agency contact, I think that's a big plus to any other agency, because they know some of the aspects of an agency business, which is like pretty quick turnaround, projects with shorter lifespans, things that focus on advertising, which not everybody wants to take part in. And so they know that you'll be able to operate in that environment.
That's interesting. One thing you brought up that's interesting is that sometimes agencies, web development agencies, will have shorter project spans because maybe they only need to, maybe they have a big client, they need to build it up for, a due date 2 months from now. So they bring in a lot of people, churn it out, and then maybe they don't need you anymore. So that's interesting to think about, because there's a lot more opportunities to build up different things for your portfolio if you can kind of come in and out and choose your projects. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there are different types of agencies, and some agencies specialize in building products and services that might be around for years to come. And some of them focus more on these short-lived campaigns that you might see for online for only a day or two. So it's kind of whatever you're into. And some people are a lot more comfortable just staying in one place and working on one thing for, years at a time. And some people really like that fresh mindset and workload that comes with projects that turn over more frequently.
Interesting. What do you see as the difference between a consultant versus a freelancer? Is there a difference in what, if you're consulting on a project versus freelancing on a project?
Oh, good question. I've definitely had projects where I felt more like a consultant, and ones that I felt more like a freelancer. I'm trying to think of what those are. I think a consultant to me implies a little more agency and a little more responsibility over your own business, versus a freelancer. Like I would be a freelancer for an agency where I'm just I essentially become an employee of their organization, even if it's just for a short amount of time, and I'm expected to kind of adhere to their policies and represent their best interests versus a consultancy, I am my own business, and the work that I do, I need to take responsibility for. Usually there's a lot more contracts involved where I have to draw up a contract and come to an agreement about timeline and budget and scope and things like that. So, but there's also more potential financial gains, I guess, that I could see with being a consultancy versus a free agent.
So it sounds like a consultant is somebody who is going to be negotiating anything from the rates, the scope, meaning the time it's going to take to do something, drawing up, I don't know, invoices, all this kind of stuff. And maybe just having kind of more authority in responsibility in building the project, whereas a consultant might hire a freelancer to do one aspect of that. You come in and you do the ad campaign design, or you come in and you just do the analytics. Is that kind of the how you think of it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to sum it up. I mean, I'm not an expert in those lines that get drawn for sure, but I think that's a pretty decent summation
Yeah.
of it.
And the reason I bring it up is because I don't think there is necessarily an expert. I mean, people use these terms. You can Google it right now, and you're going to find the opposite meaning just on somebody's blog somewhere. There's just lots of different ways to use the terms. But yeah, what you're describing is generally how I see it as well. And yeah, I think it just having some command and confidence in how you define yourself is just really important, because I think being vague or being unsure is probably really the only wrong answer when you're trying to present yourself to work on a job.
I
So as
think
long
so
as
too.
as long as you
Yeah.
have some opinion on it, probably helps you
Mhm.
out.
Yeah, I think honestly, the more you can really be specific about what your needs are and be transparent, the more highly regarded and better paid and better your day-to-day work experience will be. And it like I said before, it has taken me a long time to learn that, but I think people are okay hearing you state your needs, whether those be what you want to make or how many hours you want to work or where you want to work from. And just because what you want out of a job is maybe not quite what another person is looking for, or what they had kind of presumed the working relationship would be, doesn't mean it's the end to the story. It can often create a healthier working relationship.
Yeah, that's amazing. That reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from, I believe it's Neil Gaiman, and he's doing this commencement speech. I forget what school, but you Google it, it'll come up. The author Neil Gaiman, and he's talking about finding work as artists after college, and he says there's only three things that you need to know to find work, and you need to be on time is number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is be nice, and number three is do good work. And then he
Yeah.
says, actually, you only need to do two of them, though. Because if you're on time and nice, people will hire you and trust you get to do good work. If you do good work and you're nice, people will be a little lenient, whether you're on time or not. And if you're on time and you do good work, man, you don't really have to be that nice. You can kind of be a dick. Which
Yeah.
I generally find is like this similar kind of experience if you're trying to find web development work. So do two of those three.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, it's a great speech. You should check it out. I think it might be called "Do Good Art" or "Do Great Art." So yeah, check it out.
I will.
Um, yeah, I have a few more things that I'm really curious to learn from you about being like making your own consulting business, being a freelancer, whatever that is. Like, how do you find clients? I guess would be if you're not working at an agency. We talked about getting a job there, but beyond that, like, how do you get your own clients?
Yeah. And it's interesting. It still ebbs and flows for me a bit. I would say most of it is through existing relationships or through word of mouth. So that being nice to work with and doing good work definitely follows you around. And if you burn any bridges, you won't get those referrals or those people passing your name along. So I have worked, I think, pretty hard at trying to be a nice person to work with and trying to maintain a good reputation. And that has brought me a lot of work engagements sort of effortlessly, which are kind of the nicest ones to have. That being said, I really do try to put my work online in a lot of different places so that people can find me. And I do that mostly just because I don't want to get stuck in a rut of the same type of work over and over again. I kind of like when I get a surprise call from out of the blue and get to take on a project that I would have normally never found out about. And some of that has come through people finding me online. That could either be through my portfolio or through social media, or I write a lot of tutorials and things like that online. And so sometimes people find me that way. And I think that's a really easy way if you've had to solve a hard technical coding challenge and done so, and it was not well documented online already. I always take those opportunities to write up how I figured it out and put it online for other people. And it's not to earn money or anything like that. It's just sort of like, hey, hope I've learned a lot from the stuff I've found online. Here's something that might help someone else in the future. But it's weirdly come back to me in ways where people see that stuff and they're like, oh, knows what they're talking about. I feel comfortable potentially hiring them for this project.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is referrals helps you get work, as well as putting your work online. And it sounds like the writing you do, which I think it's the writing at mikeheavers.com. Is that where you've done a lot of
Yeah,
articles on JavaScript and I think
I
React and machine
initially,
learning?
yeah, yeah, I initially put a lot of that stuff only on my website, and in retrospect, I wish I had put it on a platform earlier where more people just naturally go to versus just on my own website and relying on search results or something to drive to my website. So I now usually write things on Medium, um, and I think I'm am Heavers on Medium. I don't even remember off the top of my head, but both. I mean, it doesn't matter where you put your stuff. I think people, if it's as specific as some of the things that I read about, people will tend to find it when they're trying to solve their own problem like that. But this was kind of interesting to me, is I recently got approached by a publication called Heartbeat, and it was started by an AI company as a way to talk about mobile machine learning and computer vision related projects. And they had found some of the stuff that I did on Medium, and so now they, pay me a small amount if I write articles on machine learning for mobile development.
Oh,
And that was just kind of a opportunity that arose by putting my writing out on a place like Medium where other people can see it, and not on my website.
that's a great idea. So also writing about the things you're learning, it not only gives you a chance to have a sense of reflecting on what you're learning. I do this a lot on my blog where I'll just, if I'm learning something new, it is I don't you don't have to be an authority on it, but after you've written a few blog posts, even as you're just beginning to learn, you start to get some authority. People see you writing about it, they see you have interest on it, and then that's so cool that in your case, they reached out with the job more or less just because you were writing about
Yeah.
this thing that you were loved writing about.
And that's a good point that you mentioned too, that you, in the practice of writing about what you went through or what you learned, you really do learn it to a much higher level. Uh, I think because you have to explain it in very concise, simple terms, and that a lot of people potentially could be reading this thing, you have to make sure you really know what you're talking about, and not just that you were able to solve the problem, but that you can explain it in a simple way. So I've found that really helpful.
I love it. Let's focus a little bit more on getting clients. So we're talking about a few ways that clients find you. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
once you have a client, and I imagine also that once you've done some work, the more work that you do, the more clients come to you. Let's say you find a client, maybe it's your first client, you're getting started. What advice do you have for getting a rate or an estimate on how much work it's going to be? Because it seems like there's just so many, and I think we're talking about web development specifically, like making websites, making things for the web apps. How do you define that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think even now for me, I could certainly set just a flat rate of what I think I should be making, and only take jobs that are willing to pay that. And that's certainly something that people do. I'm a little more flexible with my rates depending on what type of project it is and how much I want to be working on that particular thing. So projects for nonprofits, for example, I might do a much lower rate than projects for a big company like Facebook or Google, that can afford to pay a more competitive rate. And I feel about that. Some people don't want to show any sort of, I don't know, favoritism or uh, let's call it favoritism for one company or another. But I'm pretty transparent about that with people and say that, for this type of project, I charge this much money. And a lot of times the things that you are enlisted to do as a programmer, some things are easier than others, or just command a better rate. So, a typical front end facing HTML, CSS, JavaScript website, I personally don't think should earn as much as something that's a little more experimental and cutting edge, where you more uniquely are the person that can solve that challenge.
So let's talk an example. Actually, as we're talking, I'm reminded that you designed the first 1 month blog when we made our
Yeah, that's
blog.
right. Yeah.
So we hired you. So let's just talk about. We don't have to talk specifically about that project because I forget probably as much as you do. But let's just hypothetically say, I come to you and I say, hey, Mike, I want a blog and I want it to be designed specifically for my brand. Let's say I'm an author. I'm an author. How do I get started? Like, can you just kind of talk me through like what I can expect as far as price or even the languages, or what do I need to know? I'm confused. Help me. That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I definitely hear that exact, some form of that from anybody who's never really, enlisted someone to build a website for them before. And I think this is where if you know how to speak to that question well, it makes the difference of you landing the job versus someone else. And I think the way to approach it for me has been just to first ask a lot of questions. The more information you can gather before you start talking is really helpful, because you find out what the person's motivations are, what their budget is. Um,
Can we do that right now? I just
yeah.
think it'd be so fascinating. Like,
Sure.
I have an idea in mind. Help
Okay.
me out. What kind of questions did you ask me?
Okay. So you're looking to build a website uh, to represent yourself as an author.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, literally, I'll use myself. I'm working on a book right now, so I'm going to need a website. I'm assuming I don't have one. Like, how would I get started?
And what's kind of the scope of this website? Like, are you going to be selling things on the website? Is it just a marketing page? Will it have multiple pages?
I mostly imagine that it will have some examples of my writing and an about page, probably links to social media, maybe a few videos that I make. I don't think it'll sell things, maybe just kind of link to the Amazon page for the book.
Okay. And are you picturing most of the traffic for this website being driven from some other source, or is it kind of
Uh,
SEO a really important
I didn't really think of that,
component of
but
it?
I just imagine that I would be giving it would be on the book, and it would maybe be something that in interviews I would reference. So I just kind of think it would be there to support people who already know me. I don't know that it needs to have like inbound people just randomly finding it. I don't think
Mhm.
that's the goal.
Okay. And are there any sort of tools or things like that that you would want on the website that are more than just sort of static and presentational in nature?
What do you mean by static?
Static meaning it's just the content is there, it's not moving, it's like it's like a digital newspaper, versus dynamic being something that is interactive or animated, or provides sort of like tools that you can manipulate to learn things about whatever is represented in the content of your book.
You mean like you could like dive into the book and like highlight passages and have friends social media like them, like that. That's what you mean? No, none of that. Just
Yeah,
like
sure,
pretty
sure.
simple, pretty simple. Yeah,
Okay,
static. Yeah, static.
gotcha. So a few pages, static website, um, needs to look really nice.
Yes, that's
Uh,
important. That's probably the most important thing. I just want it to look really nice.
mhm. Okay, so as I'm getting a sense of what you're doing, I would probably be curious, and I recognize that your question is about kind of getting this work, but honestly, for me, sometimes when I hear kind of like a description of what sounds like a little bit of a portfolio website,
Yeah, like a
um,
portfolio. Yeah.
I often honestly ask people if they've thought of something like Squarespace or what's the like Wix or some, one of those.
Weebly or one of these. Yeah.
Yeah, a little more templated website builders that someone can manage on their own.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense. Do you need like code to do that, or do you just kind of you just sign up for that and you just have a thing, right?
Yeah, you can sign up for it, and it's a little templated, and it has a kind of back end content management system interface that you have to get comfortable with, and you don't have to write code. There is that capability, and sometimes actually people will pay a programmer like myself to modify those templates to really make them unique or make them do a thing that they wouldn't typically have been designed to do, and that's an
Interesting.
opportunity.
So
Um,
have you gotten work before just kind of editing Squarespace pages? Is that's been a job?
I have actually. I have done a Squarespace project, and I used to do a ton of WordPress. Um,
Like theme customization.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. That makes sense. I'm gonna break out of the role playing. Although
Yeah.
it was actually an interesting way for me to pick your brain on and to see like how you would solve that
Mhm.
problem. But yeah, I think I would probably generally go about the same way, where it's like that's the easy kind of option is using Squarespace or WordPress or one of these kind of if
Mhm.
it's like a static site. I like the way you described that. That makes a lot of sense. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason I steered there, and I know that's kind of was a little bit off topic, is I want to make sure that I'm operating in a place that I really add value, and that when I build this thing for this person, it's something that they feel good having paid the amount of money that they needed to pay for, and that I delivered something that they couldn't find anywhere else. And there's plenty of projects where that necessitate someone, a freelance developer. But there's some that, honestly, a person might be better just like running a templated Squarespace website.
cool. That makes sense. Yeah, because in my mind, what makes sense is that Squarespace and WordPress and these kind of sites, they basically give you that back end that make you easy to edit the content. They host it. Like they just kind of solves a lot of these things. And so it sounds like you could take this and probably request a lot of money to make the site and like all this, but maybe at your stage in your career, you're saying, you don't really, why reinvent the wheel if it's simple enough? Is kind of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I got
Well,
it.
and some people even, one thing I've noticed is some people, like, even though they might know about something like Squarespace and maybe even feel comfortable diving in, they just know that that's not what they've got. Plenty on their plates as it is, being, a writer or a musician or whatever they do. They don't want to be also a web developer, and they want you to just handle it. And they want somebody who's going to be capable of doing that no matter what it requires. And so that's where you really add value, is in just making this thing painless for them.
Love it. Have you had any big fuck ups or failures when you were working with clients? Any lessons learned that you can share with us? Because yeah, it's a lot of responsibility. You're building this identity, this website, this branding for a company, and there's a lot of moving parts. Anything come to
Yeah.
mind that that maybe
Yeah.
didn't work out so well?
Yeah. I think a few things. When I was first starting out, I think a big issue, and we touched on this, was just not charging enough, to where sometimes things come up in the course of making a website for somebody, and if you're not charging by the hour, which you certainly can charge by the hour, but if you're working on a project rate, or if something occurs that maybe you do mess up and you're not charging enough to cover like the amount of time it takes to recover from that mistake, uh, it's going to cause a lot of problems, and it's going to be very stressful for you, and you're not going to want to work on it, and the client's not going to be happy. And also the clients that are willing to, I hope this doesn't come up too sounding too harsh, but you know, the type of client that is going to be willing to underpay you, or only hire someone who charges a very cheap amount for their work, is not always going to be the best client to work for. They're not going to have a lot of leeway for these problems or timeline, delays that occur that are hard to predict when you start out a project. So my first mistake was kind of like just not charging enough, and not holding off for the right type of projects. I think another mistake that stands out is, and this was actually more of a concern kind of a few years back, but it definitely still is a big concern, but maybe on a higher level now, is website security and not taking that seriously. I don't enjoy thinking about web security. It's just not a problem I'm interested in solving, but it's kind of comes with the territory. And if you don't understand it and you don't do the basics when it comes to securing a website and a person's data and information, you can get into a lot of trouble. So I think taking some time to understand web security.
How do you learn about web security? What's a resource for that, or a book or something?
That's a good question. I've never honestly read like a book on it. I think when I choose a platform, or when I take on a platform that someone already has, platform being like WordPress or Squarespace or React, or if on the back end maybe it's your database like MySQL or Contentful or whatever it is, it's really reading about that platform and understanding the security concerns. I think WordPress even now is, can really be exploited for its security flaws if you don't know what you're doing. And that's not necessarily because it's any more susceptible than other platforms. It may or may not be. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but it's so widely used that I think it's really highly targeted. Someone can write a script that goes out and targets every single WordPress website out there, and can really spam it, or do a DDoS attack or something like that. So understanding it in that way, just doing a little bit of research before you pick your platform or take on a new one.
Or the plugin, sometimes the plugins as well. Like you'll pick the platform,
Yes.
but then you'll add all these plugins which other people write, and if you're not wise about which ones you use, you're just adding all of this potential vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and that's a big thing, like even with things like NPM packages. I don't know how deep we want to go into the
Yeah,
tech
sure,
talk,
sure.
but the nowadays websites, you have so many dependencies. When you install React or some other framework, you're automatically including the code of just hundreds of different people's work, and any one of those can have some potential vulnerabilities. I remember there was a simple plugin, I think it was like a left pad plugin on NPM. Do you remember this? That someone wrote, where they decided to unpublish it from NPM, and it crashed websites everywhere because everybody used this tiny little package on Node that added some left padding to a line or something like that.
That's
So yeah,
amazing. Yeah, I think that was in like
yeah,
2016 or something, and yeah,
yes,
I heard
yeah.
about that. Yeah, um, that's
So
amazing. Yep.
I definitely, not to say that you shouldn't, use these things, but I do think that I like to start as simple as possible when I'm building something, and not add tools and plugins unless they're really needed.
Nice. That's a great answer. I want to finish out I'm just kind of hopping along to the next section here
Sure.
of just
Yeah.
some rapid fire questions. Just looking for some short answers or some quick thoughts on a few different questions, which will help me get a sense of what tools you use for the job. So
Mhm.
I'm just going to start off here. What is the best language or languages to learn if you want to become a freelance web developer?
Oh, these are supposed to be quick and easy.
Just
uh,
fire off what you think.
sure. So on the front end, I think React is a huge one. It's just got a big user base, and there's a lot of employment opportunities for somebody who knows React or React Native. On the back end, I really have been into these sort of no SQL platforms. These rather than using MySQL or MongoDB, it's cloud-based database platforms. Things like Contentful, Firebase from Google, um, Netlify, CMS. So on the back end, some of those. And for things like animation, learning a data visualization framework like D3, uh, WebGL frameworks like Three.js, um, GSAP, a GreenSock animation platform, usually comes in handy in a lot of different projects that I do.
Great. What about for getting a job? Are the answers the same more or less for getting a job versus, I mean, if you're going to get a job, I guess you could potentially be more specific. Are there any of those you mentioned? Is there one that's specific you think in demand or in need skill?
Yeah, React, back to React, I guess. I'm always asked if I know React, and usually whether they end up going that route or not, the intention is always to start with React. And usually it's up to me or the group to kind of step back away from React if we have to.
So one interesting thing about React coming up, what advice would you have? What do you have to learn before? Because you can't just start learning React. You need to learn some things
No.
before you learn React. So how do you start on that journey? What are the first steps on that?
Mm-hmm. I think you should really only be using React if you know how to do the exact same thing without React.
Ah, okay.
um, and what React, not the exact same things, but so what React brings is really a sense of state management. So keeping track of what has changed as a user starts to use your website and stores certain preferences or uses certain features. React does a really good job of making sure the entire application can know about those things that the user has done and respond to them. So, for example, if you added something to a cart, uh, the cart would know that something was going into it, but the page where the person added the thing from the cart would know to like make a little flash or collapse the box that was holding the item that you added. Um, and your analytics platform would know to note that you prefer this color of t-shirt over this other thing. So React brings a lot of that kind of stuff. But the core fundamentals that you needed to know, even just to have that t-shirt that you could add to your cart, come with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc.
Got it. Good path. Two more questions. So, do you have a favorite IDE or text editor for coding?
I use VS Code, Visual Studio Code by Microsoft, which
Ah,
I would have never thought, I don't know, 5 years ago that I'd be using a Microsoft piece of software, especially on a Mac. But it's a really great editor. It does so much for you, and it means you have to know incrementally less about the language that you're writing, or remember less uh, about the language that you're writing, because it just handles a lot of that stuff for you. It does things like code completion. I mean, a lot of these IDEs will do this, but this has a really good concept of what they call IntelliSense, where you start typing something and it has it can autocomplete like the function call or the library to include, or it can highlight where you've made errors or where you need to add semicolons or brackets or whatever. And it's got a bunch of really good plugins that people have written that you can incorporate to handle different languages, different frameworks, etc.
beautiful. And final question, what resources do you read or podcasts, or I guess the question is, how do you stay up to date on all the new technologies related to web development?
Yeah, and I would almost say like the challenge for me is how to not overdo it, because I for a while was reading like 5 different email newsletters, that were just full of links about JavaScript or web design or CSS, and then I was seeing things on Twitter and Instagram, and then just researching a ton of things on my own for my specific projects that I was working on, and it was taking up a huge portion of my time, and I actually had to kind of scale back from that. I think that the best way to stay informed is to pick one platform that you like to consume that media on, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or just email. And if in the case of email, maybe it's subscribe to a few good newsletters. If it's Twitter, it's go out and have an account where all you do is follow. For me, it's creative coders. So I have a feed that's full of only people who talk about their projects in creative coding. And that's kind of how I stay on top of what's new and what's happening.
Can you share that feed with us? Because then we can see who you're following.
Yeah, sure. That account is twitter.com, Heavers Mike.
I see it. Yep.
And so I don't actually even post much on this, but I follow some really great creative coders.
Oh, great. Yeah. You only have 90 people on here, and I can see all their profiles. This is a great place. This is a great resource. This is great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was so much fun. I learned a ton, and I'm really excited to share this with everybody at 1 month.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it online, and I'm really proud of seeing all the stuff that you've come up with for 1 month, and for people kind of getting started where I was many years ago. It's great to have 1 month as a resource.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah. We'll talk soon.
All right.
Later. Bye. Sweet, dude. Awesome. That was great.